For 43 years, Rowena had made herself small enough to survive, small enough to be useful in the fields, small enough to be ignored at home, small enough to stand beside a man who had once called her his mate, and then looked at her as if she were only a mistake he had finally grown tired of carrying. So when the village hall filled with smoke, murmurs, and the smell of burning herbs, Rowena already knew what kind of night this was. The kind where a woman's future could be decided as if she were a possession. Her former companion had arranged for her to join Darius, the rebel alpha king no one in the territory trusted, a ruler spoken of in half-whispers and fearful glances. They said he was harsh, untamed, a male without honor. But when Rowena stood beneath the lantern light and felt every eye in the room weighing her like a thing, it was Darius who looked at her as if she were more than the bargain, more than the shame, more than the silence her former mate had left her to carry. Rowena told herself she was replaceable, too old, too plain, too late. Yet the earth beneath her bare feet had never believed that lie. It stirred when her breath shook. It listened when her heart broke. And when Darius finally stepped closer, the air changed around them, heavy with cedar, night wind, and something wild enough to make her skin prickle. Then he took her hand, and the ground answered with a deep, living pulse, as if the land itself had recognized her destiny before she ever dared to name it. If you love intense stories about wolves, with destiny and twists and turns, subscribe to the channel now. We post videos every day, so subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any episodes. How about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, author of the stories, and you? Comment below with your name and which city you're watching from. The village hall felt smaller than it had any right to feel. Rowena stood in the center of it with her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her fingers had gone stiff, and still she refused to let anyone see how hard her heart was beating. The room smelled of smoke, old wood, damp wool, and the bitter sweetness of the herbs burning in the iron bowl near the elder's table. It was the kind of smell that clung to ceremonies and judgments, to endings disguised as duty. Around her, people shifted in uneasy silence. Some kept their eyes on the floor. Some watched her too openly. A few women looked as if they wanted to reach for her, then thought better of it. Their pity would have been kinder if it had not been wrapped in fear. At the front of the hall, her former companion stood with his shoulders squared and his jaw locked. He wore the expression of a man who had convinced himself he was being reasonable. Beside him sat the village elders, grave and still, as if this were a practical matter and not a woman's life being measured in front of a crowd. And between them all stood Darius. He had arrived like a storm that had decided to wear human skin. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly calm, he seemed made of dark lines and restrained force. His coat was black, his boots clean from the road, and his face carried the kind of stillness that made the room feel quieter around him. Rowena had heard the stories before she ever saw him. Rebel alpha king, dangerous ruler, dishonored male, a man who had broken with the old ways and made enemies out of anyone who expected obedience. But the stories had not prepared her for the way he looked at her now. Not with hunger, not with pity, with attention. That was somehow worse, and somehow far more unsettling. Her former companion cleared his throat. "You understand the arrangement." The words landed in the room like a door shutting. Rowena did understand. She understood that no one had asked what she wanted. She understood that her body, her labor, and her loyalty had been useful only until they became inconvenient. She understood that a woman could spend years tending a home, mending wounds, feeding the hungry, and still be treated as something a man could trade away when he no longer found her valuable. No one spoke of the seasons she had carried this village through. No one mentioned the animals that had followed her, or the stubborn richness that always seemed to rise in the soil wherever she planted her hands. Those things had never counted the way a son would have counted. A son, a heir, a proof of worth. She had failed at the one thing her companion had decided mattered most. And so now she stood here, dressed in plain gray linen, being transferred from one man's authority to another's. Rowena lifted her chin. If she had to be humiliated, she would not make it easy for them. Darius's gaze shifted over her face, and something unreadable moved in his expression. He did not look pleased. He did not look bored. He looked as though he had expected to find a woman broken by shame, and had instead found something that refused to bend. Her former companion let out a small, irritated breath. "She is yours to take, if you will have her." The room tightened. Rowena felt the insult of it right down to her bones. If you want her. As if she were not standing there. As if she were a bundle tied in cloth. A crate at market. A burden to be taken off one man's hands and placed onto another's. Heat rose behind her eyes, but she would not cry. She had cried enough in private. She had learned long ago that tears did not soften men who had already chosen not to see you. Darius finally spoke. His voice was low, deep, and steady enough to cut through the room without effort. "And is she being offered or discarded?" The question struck like a match. A few people shifted. One of the elders frowned. Her former companion's mouth tightened, and for the first time since Rowena had entered the hall, he looked uncertain. Rowena did not turn her head, but she felt the change in the room. Darius had not defended her like a lover might have. He had not promised kindness. He had done something far more dangerous. He had named the truth. Her former companion's face darkened. "Do not make this difficult. Then do not make it dishonorable," Darius replied. The silence that followed was so complete, Rowena could hear the faint crackle of the herbs burning in the iron bowl. She could also hear, strangely, the small sounds of the living world outside the hall. A horse stamping once, a dog giving a low whine, the wind moving through the outer branches of the trees. And beneath it all, something else, something deep, something waiting. Rowena felt it in the soles of her feet first, a subtle tightening in the ground beneath the packed earth floor. Then a warmth spread upward through her ankles, faint but undeniable, like the earth had exhaled around her. Her breath caught. No one else seemed to notice. Or if they did not know what it meant. Rowena did. The land always answered when she was pushed too far. It had done it since she was a girl, when she could still kneel in a field and feel the soil hum under her palms. She had never understood the gift fully, only that plants grew better near her, wounded animals calmed in her presence, and the oldest trees seemed to lean toward her when she passed. Her mother had once called it a blessing. Her companion had called it a strange habit. The village called it little more than luck. But this was no luck. This was the first warning. Darius noticed her reaction. His eyes sharpened, and for one strange, suspended moment, the rebel king looked less like a ruler and more like a man who had just realized he was standing too close to something sacred. Rowena turned her gaze to him at last, and that was when he stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He came close enough for Rowena to catch the scent of him: cedar, night air, leather warmed by travel, and a faint metallic note beneath it that reminded her of old stone and cold rain. It was not an unpleasant scent. It was, in fact, disturbingly steadying. He stopped in front of her. Then, before her former companion could say another word, Darius reached out and took her hand. The contact was immediate and electric. Rowena felt it race up her arm and settle in her chest, where it struck against something old and buried and suddenly alert. The room tilted by the smallest degree. The air seemed to thicken. Somewhere outside, the dogs began to bark all at once, and the horses answered with nervous stamping, as if the whole village had just felt the same thing she had. The earth shuddered. Not violently. Not enough for anyone to fall. Just enough for the lantern flames to flicker hard and the burning herbs to hiss in their bowl. Rowena drew in a sharp breath as a warm, living pulse moved through the floor beneath her feet, deep as a heartbeat and ancient as stone. It was not fear. It was recognition. Her former companion stared. Darius looked down at her hand in his, then back at her face, his expression unreadable and far too intense. And Rowena, standing in the center of a hall where everyone had come to watch her be diminished, suddenly knew with terrifying certainty that something had begun the moment his skin touched hers, something the village would never be able to take back. The corridor outside the hall was colder than Rowena expected. Not cold in the way winter was cold, with its honest bite and white breath and frozen fingers. This was the kind of cold that lived in old timber and stone, in places where secrets had been kept too long. The villagers had already begun to scatter behind her, their murmurs folding into the night air like scraps of paper blown from a table. She could still feel their eyes on her back, and yet the hand around hers gave her something far more immediate to focus on. Darius's hand was large, warm, and steady. He had not tightened his grip. He had not dragged her. If anything, the first surprise of it was that he seemed to be matching his pace to hers, as though he had already understood that a woman whose future had just been decided by others. Rowena told herself not to read too much into that. Men could be courteous for a moment and cruel by dawn. Still, the absence of pressure unsettled her more than force might have. She had been prepared for commands, for ownership spoken aloud, for the familiar sharpness of being managed. Instead, Darius walked beside her as if he had only just taken her hand to steady her, and the strangeness of that nearly made her stumble. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Nothing about him suggested he missed much. "Careful," he said, and his voice, low in the dark, seemed to settle between them like a cloak. The steps dipped near the arch. Rowena shot him a quick look. "You mean the steps that anyone with eyes can see?" For the first time since he had taken her hand, something flickered over his mouth. Not a smile exactly. More like the shape of one that had not fully trusted itself to exist. "You would be surprised how many people miss obvious things when they are angry," he said. The answer was so dry, so unexpectedly amused, that Rowena had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She had expected a ruler carved from dark rumor. She had not expected wit. They crossed the narrow stone path between the hall and the main gate. Lantern light hung from iron hooks along the wall, each flame bending a little in the wind. Beyond the gate, the night had fully gathered, all blue-black sky and moving shadows. A waiting carriage stood near the road, simple and dark, with two broad horses stamping softly in place. No gleaming escort, no parade, no display of power. That, too, was surprising. Rowena had imagined a king arriving like a threat on horseback, with a line of guards and enough steel to make the whole village bow. Instead, Darius had come almost quietly, as if he believed the world should already know to make room for him. A man at the carriage gave a respectful nod. Older, thin, round-shouldered. He wore a faded scarf tucked around his neck, and had the alert, slightly bewildered expression of someone who had spent most of his life expecting trouble and occasionally being amused by it. "Well," he said, looking directly at Rowena as if she were the only interesting part of the evening. "This is a grand first meeting. I've seen harsher weather and less drama in a churchyard." Darius sighed through his nose. Milo. So that was his name. Milo, apparently, seemed unbothered by the warning in that single word. He tipped his head at Rowena in something close to a bow. "Don't worry, lady. If he tries to be dreadful, I can usually distract him with tea." Rowena blinked once. Then, to her horror, a laugh escaped her. It was small and surprised and far too real for the night she had been having, but it broke out of her before she could stop it. Milo's face brightened at once, as if he had been waiting all his life for evidence that she was, in fact, still alive under all that humiliation. Darius looked at her. The look was not annoyed. Not quite. More like he had not expected that sound and was deciding whether to be pleased by it. Rowena straightened. "I'm sorry if laughter has offended your kingdom. It has not yet come to that," Darius said. Milo made a thoughtful sound. "Give it time. He's very committed to looking grim." Darius opened the carriage door himself. That, too, was unexpected. Rowena had not known what she expected exactly, only that it was not this steady, quiet lack of spectacle. No grand declaration, no restraints, no visible claim of ownership, no ceremonial claiming spoken before witnesses, only a door held open by a man who had been presented to her, in the space of a breath, as something close to a monster. The inside of the carriage smelled faintly of cedar, leather, and the peppery warmth of old blankets. A small lamp had been fixed to the side wall, casting a soft amber glow over the bench seats and the folded travel cloak resting on one side. Rowena hesitated. Darius noticed that too. "You may sit," he said. And this time there was no command in it, only space. She stepped up carefully and took the far seat, instinctively keeping a little distance between them. Not because he had done anything wrong, because everything about this night had gone wrong in ways too large to name, and she did not yet trust the silence between them to remain harmless. Darius entered after her and settled opposite her with the ease of a man who was perfectly aware that he made any room feel smaller. Once the carriage started moving, the wheels gave a soft, steady rhythm over the road, and the village began to slip away behind them. Rowena looked out the window as the hall grew smaller in the dark. No one had come running after her. No one had called her name. The ache of that should have been familiar by now, but it still tightened in her chest all the same. "You are thinking very loudly," Darius said after a moment. Rowena turned her head slowly. "I wasn't aware that was possible. It is when someone is trying not to ask a question." She folded her hands in her lap. "Then perhaps you should stop noticing." He rested one elbow against the carriage wall, watching her with too much calm. That would make this journey terribly dull. She could not tell whether he was teasing her or warning her that he would continue to be difficult. The uncertainty made her wary. It also, annoyingly, made him seem more human. The carriage rocked gently as they turned onto the main road. Outside, the fields stretched dark and open under the moonlight. Rowena knew those fields. Knew the low bend by the willow tree, the place where foxes sometimes crossed at dawn, the old stone marker half swallowed by grass near the eastern fence line. It felt strange to see them from this angle, as something leaving rather than something she belonged to. Darius followed her gaze. "Do you miss it already?" She almost answered no out of pride, but the truth was too close to the surface. "I miss what it should have been." That made him quiet. It was only for a second, but she felt the change. Darius's gaze shifted from her face to her hands and then to the window, as if the answer had touched something in him he had not meant to show. "What do you know about what it should have been?" he asked at last. The question was not harsh. That was what made it dangerous. There was no mockery in it. No test she could clearly see. Just a clean, level inquiry from someone who seemed to think he might actually want the truth. Rowena lowered her eyes. "Enough to know this wasn't it." "Wasn't what?" "The life I was promised." The words came out quieter than she expected. The life anyone would wish for themselves. Darius was silent long enough that she thought he might let the matter go. Instead, he said, "People promise many things when they are young and frightened." His tone had changed, not colder, more distant, as if the words had brushed against a memory he had no interest in touching again. Rowena looked up at him. "And you? What did you promise when you were young?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Milo, perched outside with the driver, chose that exact moment to shout through the window. "Nothing sensible, I'd wager." Rowena startled. Darius closed his eyes briefly. From outside came the sound of Milo humming, as if he had not just interfered in a royal conversation. Rowena, despite herself, smiled. Darius opened one eye and looked at her with unmistakable suspicion. "You are enjoying this." "I'm enjoying him." "That is unfortunate." "Why?" "Because he will now believe he has become your favorite person. Has he not?" "Absolutely not." Milo, from somewhere outside, called, "I heard that, and it was rude." Rowena bit back another laugh, and to her amazement, Darius's mouth shifted again in that almost smile she was beginning to recognize. It made him look less like a legend, and more like a dangerous man who had not quite decided whether he disliked being amused. The road continued under them, steady and unbroken. For a time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not easy, but it was no longer empty. Rowena found herself listening to the carriage's soft sway, the distant call of a night bird, the faint breathing of the horses, and the strange awareness of the man across from her. She was uncomfortably conscious of his presence, of the quiet strength in his posture, of the way his attention seemed to rest on her without crowding her. At one point, the carriage tilted over a rut, and Rowena reached instinctively for the side wall. Darius moved at the same time. His hand caught her wrist before she could steady herself. Not hard. Just enough to stop her from jolting against the bench. The contact was brief, but her skin reacted before her mind did. A soft shiver moved up her arm, and she felt it in the pit of her stomach like the start of a note. His eyes dropped to her wrist, then lifted to her face. Neither of them moved. It should have been nothing. A small, practical touch. A moment of balance. Instead, the air in the carriage turned warmer by a degree, and Rowena became acutely aware of his scent again. Cedar, leather, cool night air, and something deeper beneath it. Something that made her think of storm-soaked bark and rain on stone. It was not sweet. It was not soft. It was, impossibly, comforting. Darius released her as if he had felt the shift too. "You are not used to leaving your village," he said. Rowena flexed her hand once, then tucked it back into her lap. "That obvious? You keep looking out as though the world might change if you stare long enough. Does it?" "Sometimes." The answer was so matter-of-fact that she almost missed its weight. The carriage turned again. The road began to slope gently upward, and the fields gave way to a line of wild trees that grew denser as they climbed. Rowena knew these woods too, though only at the edges. Beyond them lay territory few villagers entered willingly. Old paths, quiet places, places where the land seemed to hold its breath. And there, for the second time that night, the earth stirred under her feet. Rowena went still. It started as a faint vibration through the floorboards, subtle enough that another woman might have mistaken it for the carriage wheels. But Rowena knew better. She felt it in her bones. A low, living thrum rising from the ground itself, as if something beneath the road had awakened and recognized her passing. Her breath caught. Darius noticed at once. "What is it?" Rowena shook her head, though she wasn't sure she was answering him. Her gaze had gone to the trees. One branch, laden with silver leaves, had bent slightly toward the road despite the wind moving in the opposite direction. "The land," she whispered before she could stop herself. Darius studied her face. Not the window, not the trees, but her. "It does that often?" "Only when it wants my attention." That earned a quiet exhale from him that might have been amusement. "And what does it want now?" Rowena listened. The pulse in the ground was not painful. It was not even frightening. It felt like a warning, yes, but also like welcome, like a hand pressing gently against the door of a room she had never been allowed to enter. "I don't know," she admitted. The carriage rolled deeper into the trees. Outside, the road narrowed. The night thickened. A fox darted across the path and vanished into the brush, then stopped just long enough to turn and look directly at Rowena before disappearing again. She sat up straighter. Darius saw the fox too, but he did not comment. Instead, he glanced toward the trees with the kind of attention that suggested he was cataloging every movement around them. Rowena found herself studying him in return. There was an age in his face that had nothing to do with years, a weariness that did not soften him, only sharpened the edges of him more deeply. And yet beneath that, there was restraint, care, even if he would never call it that. He was not the senseless tyrant the village had painted, not entirely. There was control in him, and vigilance, and the clear awareness of a man used to being misunderstood. That did not make him safe, but it did make him interesting in a way she resented immediately. She cleared her throat. "Is your kingdom always this dramatic?" Darius gave her a dry look. "You mean the moonlit woods, the whispering ground, and the unexpected commentary from the carriage driver? Yes? That is only the beginning." She looked out the window again, though now her mouth twitched against her will. "I'm trying very hard to be alarmed." "You are failing." "I know. And yet you appear to be coping." Rowena glanced at him. "You say that as if it is a rare skill." "It is." Before she could answer, Milo's voice called from outside, bright with far too much enjoyment. "If either of you start sounding fond, I'll need warning. I'm too old for surprises." Rowena laughed again, softer this time, and this time she did not hide it. Darius watched her in silence for a beat too long. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "You have not laughed in a long time." The gentleness of the remark caught her off guard. Rowena's expression tightened before she could stop it. "You know that? I know what grief sounds like when it leaves a room." She turned her face toward the window so he would not see how that struck her. The woods thickened. The road curved. Ahead, through the dark, she began to make out the first lanterns of the territory beyond the village. Not a fortress, not yet, but a line of light waiting in the distance like someone had set a handful of stars along the hill. Her throat tightened. She did not know what waited for her there. She did not know what Darius intended, or why the earth reacted to his touch, as if something ancient had already begun to move between them. She only knew that the life she had left behind had not simply ended. It had been cut, and the shape of the cut had Darius's handprint in it. Milo's voice drifted in once more, light and theatrical. "Good news, lady. The king's fort is very hard to get lost in, which is useful because he is not." Darius closed his eyes again. Rowena pressed a hand to her mouth, and this time she could not stop the smile. When she looked back at him, Darius was watching her with a look she could not yet name. Not tender, not cruel. Something in between, and more dangerous because of it. As the carriage rolled toward the lanterns in the dark, Rowena felt the land beneath her give one more quiet pulse. Not a warning this time. A promise. The first thing Rowena noticed about Darius's territory was the silence. Not emptiness. Not the kind that came after abandonment. This silence felt alive, held in place by old trees, sleeping earth, and walls that had learned to guard what stood within them. Even the air seemed different here, clearer somehow, touched by pine and riverstone, and the faint mineral scent of rain that had not yet fallen. The carriage passed through a gate of dark timber and iron that stood open beneath two lanterns. Beyond it stretched a wide path lined with low gardens, winter herbs, and carefully tended shrubs that kept their shape even under the moonlight. The fort was not a glittering palace. It was not the kind of place built to impress visitors. It was older than that, sturdier, made to endure. Rowena found herself studying every detail. A pair of guards stood to the side as the carriage passed, but they only bowed their heads. No one shouted. No one slammed spear butts against the ground. No one acted as if she had arrived as a prisoner. That unsettled her almost as much as the kindness had in the carriage. Darius noticed her looking. "You expected cages?" he asked. Rowena turned her head slowly. "I expected a place built by a man everyone calls dishonorable." Milo, who had climbed down first and was now opening the side door with a flourish, muttered, "That's not a great review for the architecture." Darius ignored him. And this doesn't look like one." "No," Darius said. "It does not." That answer was too simple to be reassuring. Rowena stepped carefully down from the carriage, one hand briefly touching the edge for balance. The ground beneath her boots was packed earth laid over stone, and the moment her feet settled there, the same strange pull from earlier moved through her again. Softer now, but unmistakable. Her breath caught. Darius saw it immediately. Again. She took a careful breath and nodded once. "The land here is awake." "Good," Milo said brightly. "We like awake things. Much easier to feed." Darius gave him a look. "You are not helping." "I am always helping. It's my gift." Rowena was still trying to sort through the strange calm of the place when a figure emerged from the inner corridor carrying a bundle of folded cloth over one arm and a basket balanced on the other. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked braids pinned neatly at her crown, dressed in practical brown wool, her expression so matter-of-fact that Rowena immediately trusted her more than she wanted to. The woman took in Rowena in a single glance. "So, this is her." Milo clapped a hand over his chest. "Excellent. We've moved from rumor to appraisal." Darius said, "Nessa." Nessa ignored him entirely and walked straight toward Rowena. "You're thinner than I expected." Rowena, who had survived enough uncomfortable introductions to recognize one when she saw it, stared back. "You expected me?" "I expected whoever he dragged in with that expression," Nessa said, jerking her chin toward Darius. "I was only uncertain whether she'd be furious or catatonic." Milo made a delighted sound. "I like her." Darius sighed. "You are all exceptionally disrespectful." "And yet," Nessa said, handing the basket to Milo without looking at him, "you keep us." Milo looked down into the basket and gasped with the reverence of a man discovering holy treasure. Fresh honey cakes. She does keep me. Yes. Rowena's mouth twitched. It had been years since anyone in authority had spoken to her with such blunt familiarity that it bordered on comfort. She did not know what to do with it. Nessa finally held out her hand. Come along, then. You'll want warmth before you decide whether to dislike the king properly. Rowena hesitated only a moment before taking it. The older woman's grip was firm and dry, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime solving practical problems and had no patience for nonsense. Rowena was led through a wide corridor lit by wall lamps and lined with woven tapestries that showed forests, rivers, and fields in rich, earthy colors. No blood-red banners, no symbols of conquest, just land, light, and old stories. She tried not to look too interested. Nessa noticed anyway. You've never seen a house like this. It's not a house, Rowena said, taking in the high beams and broad stone floor. It's a fortress pretending not to be one. Milo, now chewing happily on one of the cakes, pointed at her with admiration. She sees through the king's lies already. Darius's voice came from behind them. Milo, if you continue speaking, I may assign you to inventory. The carrier of honey cakes almost choked. Cruelty. This is cruelty. Rowena glanced back at Darius despite herself. He had removed his coat somewhere between the gate and the corridor, revealing a dark shirt fitted close across his chest and forearms. He looked even more like a man built for endurance than for ornament. Not polished, not soft, but there was no arrogance in how he moved through his own territory. People greeted him with quick bows, with nods, with the easy familiarity of those who knew his shape and expected him to notice theirs in return. That, more than anything, confused her. This was not a hall of fear, and yet the weight of his presence still altered the room. Darius stopped beside her as Nessa led them deeper into the corridor. You're staring. Rowena did not deny it. I'm trying to understand why a man so frightening keeps honey cakes in his fort. Milo, offended and pleased at once, lifted his head. I keep the honey cakes. He merely tolerates my excellence. Darius, with all the patience of a man long acquainted with inconvenience, said, Milo lives here because he once fixed a roof during a storm, and now believes this grants him social immunity. It does. Nessa snorted. It does not. Rowena, to her own surprise, laughed again. Darius looked at her as if that sound belonged somewhere he had not expected to find it. Nessa glanced between them once quickly, with the alertness of someone who had already started noticing things she might later choose to mention. Then she reached a side door and pushed it open. The room beyond was modest, warm, and beautifully plain. A bed with thick blankets, a wash basin, a small hearth crackling with low, steady fire, a table by the window, fresh towels folded with precise care. Nothing decadent, nothing threatening. The whole space felt more like a room prepared for recovery than captivity. Rowena stood still just inside the doorway. Darius did not push her farther. This is yours for now, he said. She turned, searching his face for the catch. For now? His mouth shifted slightly. You asked for honesty in the hall. I am trying it. That's not especially comforting. No, he agreed. It rarely is. There was a beat of quiet between them. Outside the room, the corridor remained alive with footfalls, the clink of dishes, Milo muttering something scandalized about cake rationing, and the low rhythm of a place continuing to function around her. Rowena folded her arms, more out of habit than defiance. Why did you take me? Darius's eyes did not leave hers. Because your future was being decided without you. That is not an answer. It is the only one you have earned from me tonight. The sharpness of it might have hurt if it had not been paired with an honesty she could not dismiss. Rowena lifted her chin. Then let me earn better. For the first time, Darius looked genuinely surprised. Not because she challenged him, because she did it without flinching. Something in his expression changed, subtle as the turn of a key. He looked past her for a moment, toward the window where the moonlight lay pale across the floor. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. The land chose you, he said. Rowena's breath went still. That sentence reached straight through the noise in her head and settled somewhere deep. She had thought the Earth's pulse earlier was a strange reaction, maybe tied to her gift, maybe tied to Darius, maybe only to shock, but the way he said it made it sound older than either of them. She watched him carefully. "Chose me for what?" "That," he said, "is what I need to find out." Before she could answer, there came a soft knock at the doorway. Nessa appeared again, this time carrying a tray with a mug of tea and a shallow bowl of stew. She took one look at the tension in the room and said, "Good. You're both still making this difficult. I was worried there'd be peace." Milo's voice floated down the corridor. "If there is peace, I'll have to invent trouble. I'm already bored." Nessa set the tray on the table and nodded toward Rowena. "Eat first. Questions later. If you try to solve your fate on an empty stomach, you'll become impossible. And he is already difficult enough for two people." "I heard that," Darius said. "Yes," Nessa replied. "That was the point." Rowena stared at the stew, then at the tea, then at the fire. Her stomach, traitor that it was, tightened with sudden hunger. She had not eaten properly since before the ceremony. The shame of that should have offended her more than it did. Nessa made a shooing motion. "Sit." Rowena almost laughed at being ordered so casually, but the humor in it softened something tight inside her. She crossed the room and sat at the table. The chair was sturdy and plain, the tea steeping beside the bowl of stew fragrant with mint and something floral beneath it. Darius remained near the doorway. "You don't have to stand there as if the walls might attack," Rowena said quietly. "I'm aware. And yet, he said after a beat, "I am deciding how much to tell you." That irritated her more than she expected. "I'm not fragile. I did not say you were. You're making decisions about me in a room where I'm finally not being treated like an object." His gaze sharpened. "Then listen carefully. I am not asking what can be done with you." The room went still. Even Nessa, halfway out the door, paused. Darius's voice was steady, but there was an edge under it now, one that had not been there before. "I am trying to understand what was done to you." The words landed differently than the village's insults had. Not because they were softer, because they were not. They were precise. They cut through the old humiliation and named the wound beneath it. Rowena looked down at the steam rising from the bowl. No one had asked that before. Not once. The silence stretched, and somewhere beyond the window the faint sound of wind moving through the territory reached the room like a breath held in the dark. Then from the corridor, Milo said in a stage whisper far too loud to be ignored, "If the king keeps speaking like that, I may faint from shock." Nessa answered, "If you faint, do it quietly." Rowena smiled despite herself, and Darius, to her disbelief, looked almost relieved by it. The moment was broken a second later by a knock at the outer door, sharp and urgent. All four of them stilled. Darius moved first. The change in him was immediate. The room seemed to narrow around his attention, his body going still in the way of a man who had just sensed trouble before anyone else could name it. He turned toward the corridor, and the faint warmth in the room cooled by a degree. Milo appeared in the doorway, honey cake forgotten. "It's the Eastern Garden," he said, suddenly serious. "The deer have gathered by the fence again, all of them, and the hounds won't go near it." Nessa's expression changed at once. Rowena rose slowly from her chair, her pulse quickening for reasons she could not yet explain. "What does that mean?" Darius looked at her for one long, measuring second, and in his eyes she saw not suspicion, but recognition. "I think," he said quietly, "the land has something to tell us." And as if to prove him right, a deep, living tremor moved through the floor beneath Rowena's feet. Rowena felt the tremor ripple through her body before it reached her ears, a deep, resonant hum that started in the soles of her feet and climbed her spine like a secret being whispered from the earth itself. The stone floor beneath the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with her own pulse, and for a moment she stood frozen, one hand still resting on the warm wooden table where her stew cooled untouched. The air in the room thickened, carrying the faint mineral scent of soil turned fresh after rain, even though they were deep inside the fort's sturdy walls. Darius was already in motion. his broad frame cutting through the sudden stillness like a shadow given purpose. He crossed to the doorway in 3 long strides, his boots making no sound on the floorboards, and leaned out into the corridor. "Milo," he called, his voice low but carrying the weight of command wrapped in urgency. "Lanterns. Eastern Garden, now." Milo appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting just beyond earshot with his usual mix of readiness and irreverence. His thin face was set in uncharacteristic seriousness, the honey cake forgotten somewhere in his wake. He snatched 2 lanterns from their hooks on the wall, their brass frames glinting in the firelight, and thrust one toward Nessa, who was already shrugging into a heavy wool shawl. On it, "Though if the deer are throwing a party without us, I'm billing them for the grass damage." Nessa shot him a look that could curdle milk, but there was no time for retorts. "Move," she said simply, and the 4 of them spilled out into the corridor together, Rowena's heart pounding in sync with the earth's subtle rhythm. The night air hit her like a cool embrace as they emerged into the courtyard, crisp and laced with the sharp tang of pine needles and distant river mist. The moon hung full and luminous overhead, bathing everything in a silver glow that made the ancient oaks along the garden path look like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out as if to touch the stars. Rowena's breath clouded in front of her as she hurried to keep pace with Darius, her simple boots crunching softly on the gravel path that wound toward the eastern fence. Milo swung his lantern ahead, casting swinging pools of golden light that danced across low hedges and winter bare flower beds, while Nessa brought up the rear, her steps measured and sure. The hum grew stronger with every step, vibrating up through Rowena's legs until it felt like walking on the skin of a living thing. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat mirror the land's call, and whispered to herself, "What do you need from me now?" The question wasn't spoken aloud, but Darius glanced back at her, his dark eyes catching the moonlight. "Stay close," he said, not as an order but as a promise, extending a hand that she took without thinking. His palm was warm, calloused from years of command and labor, and the contact sent a steadying jolt through her, like roots intertwining beneath the soil. They reached the eastern fence, a sturdy barrier of weathered oak posts laced with vine-woven wire, and there it was, dozens of deer, perhaps 50 or more, clustered against the wood in a dense, unmoving mass. Their coats gleamed silver in the moonlight, antlers interlocking like a natural crown, and their breaths rose in unified clouds that hung in the still air. They didn't graze or startle. They simply waited, eyes fixed on the fort as if expecting an audience. Beyond them, the fort's hounds paced restlessly at a distance, their whines low and uneasy, tails tucked as they refused to approach. One hound, a shaggy gray female Rowena recognized from earlier glances, lifted her head and let out a single plaintive howl that trailed off into the night. Milo held his lantern higher, the light catching the deer's glossy eyes, which reflected back like scattered stars. "I've lived here 3 years, and I've never seen a herd pull this off without at least one joker buck trying to headbutt the fence. They're organized." Nessa folded her arms, her shawl slipping slightly to reveal the practical knife sheath at her belt, not for threat, but for the everyday work of a territory keeper. Organized and ignoring the dogs. That's not natural. Rowena stepped forward slowly, the group parting to give her space. The deer shifted as one, ears flicking toward her approach, but none bolted. The lead doe, a graceful creature with a white blaze on her muzzle, stamped a front hoof once, then lowered her head in what felt unmistakably like deference. Rowena knelt at the fence line, the damp grass soaking through the knees of her dress, and pressed both palms flat against the earth. The connection hit her like a wave, warm, insistent, flooding her veins with the territory's quiet desperation. Hunger. Not in the deer, but in the soil itself. Thirst woven through the roots like parched veins. An ache of neglect, deep and long-standing, as if the land had been waiting years for hands that understood its language. Images flickered behind her closed eyes. Cracked stream beds, withered herbs, fields that yielded less each season despite the caretaker's efforts. It wasn't failure on their part. It was absence. Absence of the one soul who could speak its tongue. She opened her eyes, her voice steady despite the surge. "It's the soul root bond. My mother used to tell stories about it when I was a girl. How certain souls are born woven into the land's heartbeat, sharing its joys and wounds. The territory feels what I feel. My sorrow in the village weakened this land. It starved this place. My steadiness now. It can heal it." Darius crouched beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, a solid anchor in the moonlit night. His scent, cedar smoke, leather warmed by skin, and the faint wildness of open trails cut through the earthy air, grounding her further. "Your pain weakened it. Show me what your strength can do." The words were a challenge, but laced with something deeper. Trust, perhaps, or the first spark of partnership. Rowena nodded, closing her eyes again. She breathed deep, drawing from the core of herself. The resilience forged in years of quiet labor, the unyielding dignity that had carried her through betrayal. Rest. She willed into the bond, the golden thread pulsing brighter in her mind's eye. Grow. Remember your strength. The response was immediate and profound. The ground sighed beneath her hands, a soft exhalation that raised the hairs on her arms. Tender green shoots pierced the frost-kissed soil along the fence line, unfurling leaves that caught the moonlight like quicksilver. The deer nosed forward eagerly, lips brushing the new growth, their tension melting into calm. A gentle wind stirred the oaks overhead, carrying the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine from nowhere, as if the territory itself exhaled in relief. Even the hounds crept closer, their whines turning to contented huffs as they settled at Rowena's feet. Milo let out a low whistle, swinging his lantern in a slow arc. "Right. So that's officially magic. Can we get her to fix the privy next? It's been judging me personally." Nessa chuckled, a rare softening of her stern lines. "Practical woman. I like it. The Eastern Garden's been stubborn for seasons. No matter what we planted, it sulked." Darius rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Rowena's face. In the lantern light, his expression held a rare wonder, the hard edges of his rebel reputation giving way to something raw and reverent. "How does it feel?" "The bond." Rowena stood, brushing soil from her palms, her skin still tingling with the land's gratitude. "Like coming home to a place that's been holding its breath for you. It's responsive here. Stronger than in my village. Maybe because—" She trailed off, meeting his gaze. "Because I'm not fighting it alone anymore." His mouth quirked, the almost smile she'd glimpsed before. "Good. Tomorrow we walk the borders. There's more to wake." Milo groaned theatrically. "Borders at dawn? You're all heart, sire. Meanwhile, I'll be dreaming of honey cakes as emotional support." They lingered a while longer, watching the deer disperse into the revitalized garden, their steps light and sure. Rowena felt the bond settle, content for now, like a child tucked into bed. As they turned back toward the fort, Darius's hand brushed hers, not quite holding, but close enough to promise more. The night felt alive with possibility, the humiliation of the hall a fading echo against this new belonging. Back in her room, Nessa had left a fresh pot of mint tea steaming on the table, alongside a small loaf of seeded bread. Rowena sank into the chair by the hearth, the fire's warmth seeping into her bones. Exhaustion tugged at her, but so did a quiet joy, the kind that comes from being seen, truly seen, for the first time. Darius paused in the doorway, his silhouette filling the frame. "Rest. The land, and I, will need you strong." She nodded, a smile tugging her lips. "Even rebels need sleep? Especially rebels." His voice dropped, intimate. "Good night, Rowena." As the door clicked shut, Milo's voice echoed faintly from the hall. "If you two start whispering sweet nothings to dirt, wake me for the encore." Laughter bubbled up from Rowena's chest, light and free, chasing the last shadows of doubt. The earth pulsed once beneath the floorboards, a lullaby of acceptance. Sunlight pierced the heavy curtains like a gentle summons, painting golden bars across the woven rug and chasing away the last traces of night from Rowena's room. She stirred slowly, her body heavy with the deep, restorative sleep that follows a soul's first true exhale. The air held the comforting scents of rising bread dough and simmering herbs drifting from the kitchens below, mingling with the faint lavender from her bedding. For a blissful moment, she lingered in that hazy space between dreams and waking, the soul root bond humming softly in her chest like a purring hearth fire. Content, connected, alive. Swinging her legs over the bed's edge, Rowena's feet met the cool stone floor, and the bond responded with a welcoming warmth that climbed her calves. Beside her lay a neatly folded stack of new clothes. Soft wool trousers dyed the deep green of forest moss, a tunic of breathable linen embroidered with subtle vine patterns at the cuffs, and sturdy leather boots polished to a soft sheen. No frills, no ostentation, just practical attire suited to a woman who walked with the land. Someone, Nessa most likely, had thought of her comfort, and the gesture warmed Rowena more than the hearth ever could. Dressed and ready, she stepped into the corridor, following the murmur of voices and the rich aroma of fresh coffee toward the main hall. The fort bustled with morning life. Shifters in simple tunics carrying baskets of early vegetables, a young woman humming as she swept the flagstones, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer shaping tools rather than weapons. It felt less like a rebel stronghold and more like a living community, woven into the rhythm of the earth. She paused in the hall's arched doorway, taking it all in. The long oak table groaned under platters of food, flaky berry tarts glistening with sugar glaze, loaves of crusty bread studded with nuts and seeds, pitchers of thick cream and honey jars glowing amber in the light. At the head sat Darius, bent over rolled maps not of borders or conflicts, but of the territory's fields, irrigation channels sketched in precise ink, crop rotations marked with colored symbols, soil notes scribbled in his strong hand. Milo perched on the bench beside him, systematically demolishing a plate of pastries, crumbs dusting his scarf like fresh snow. Nessa spotted her first, waving her over with a no-nonsense gesture. There you are. Eat before Milo claims divine rights over the tarts. Milo looked up mid-bite, feigning offense. Divine rights? These are contractual obligations. The land grew berries. I provide quality control. He pushed a laden plate toward Rowena's spot across from Darius. Try one. If you don't weep with joy, I'll eat my scarf. Rowena slid onto the bench, selecting a tart. The crust shattered perfectly under her teeth, releasing a burst of sweet tart blueberries mingled with lemon zest. She closed her eyes briefly, savoring. You win. Life-changing. See? I'm a visionary. Milo beamed, then stage whispered to Darius. She's perfect. Marry her before she realizes we're all lunatics. Darius's fork paused midway to his mouth, his gaze lifting to Rowena's. In the morning light, his face held a softness the night had hidden. Faint lines at his eyes from years of squinting into windswept horizons, a jaw shadowed with dark stubble. Ignore him, though the tarts are exceptional. Nessa poured steaming coffee into Rowena's mug, the rich, nutty aroma curling up invitingly. King's got plans for the day. Northern fields. Test how far the bond stretches. Barren ground up there for half a decade. If you can wake it. Rowena sipped the coffee, its bold warmth spreading through her limbs. I'm not a plow horse. It takes what the land gives. Darius rolled a map closed with deliberate care. You gave the Eastern Garden life overnight. That's no small gift. His eyes held hers, steady and believing. The territory thrives when you're steady. We build on that. Milo leaned in, eyes wide with mock drama. Careful, lady. Compliments from him? Next, he'll admit he likes my scarf collection. One more word about scarves. Too late. Scarf supremacy reigns. Rowena laughed, the sound bright and unforced, weaving her into the group's easy rhythm. Breakfast stretched leisurely, stories flowing. Nessa recounting a stubborn mule that only Rowena's touch had calmed the day before. Milo inflating his role in last night's deer vigil to heroic proportions. Darius listened more than he spoke, but his glances to Rowena carried weight. Appreciation, curiosity, a spark of something warmer. They set out after the meal, cloaks against the crisp bite of morning air scented with frost-laced grass and wood smoke. The northern fields lay a short walk beyond the fort, past orchards where apples still clung stubbornly to branches, their skins ruby-red promises of harvest. Darius matched Rowena's stride effortlessly, Milo and Nessa trailing with packs of tools, shovels, seed pouches, water skins. The path wound uphill, revealing vistas of rolling hills where the land transitioned from tended gardens to wilder meadows, the bond pulling Rowena onward like an invisible tether. The northern fields hit her first as a hollow ache, a vast expanse of cracked, compacted soil, gray and lifeless under the climbing sun, dotted with thistle stubs that mocked past efforts. No birds sang here. The wind whispered regret through barren furrows. Rowena knelt at the edge, sinking her fingers deep into the parched earth. The bond flickered weakly, tentative. "I'm here," she breathed into it, drawing from her core. Memories of village gardens she'd coaxed through drought, the quiet pride of harvest moons, the resilience that had carried her through betrayal. Live. Stretch toward the light. Drink deep. Silence first. Then, a murmur. Fine green shoots needled upward, hesitant at first, then bolder, threading through the crust like veins of emerald. A breeze followed, moisture-laden from an unseen source, softening the ground. Wildflowers, tiny violets and resilient clover, unfurled petals, scenting the air with sweet earthiness. Birds wheeled overhead, drawn by the sudden life, their calls fracturing the hush. Darius exhaled slowly beside her. Incredible. Milo dropped his pack with a thud. She's terraforming. Darius, we naming this the Rowena Plains? Statues? Annual festival with tart-eating contests? Nessa swatted his arm lightly. Focus, fool. That's real work. They moved methodically along the border, Rowena channeling the bond at intervals, waking root systems, balancing minerals in the soil, inviting pollinators with subtle pulses of invitation. Sweat beaded her brow, muscles aching from the outpouring, but joy effervesced through her, purpose undeniable and shared. Darius stayed near, handing tools, his presence a bulwark. Once, reaching for the same seed pouch, their hands collided. Warmth sparked, lingering like a promise, neither pulling away immediately. By midday, green veins laced the field, birdsong filled the air, and a distant stream burbled to life, fish flashing silver in its shallows. They paused under a sprawling oak for lunch. Fresh bread, sharp cheese, crisp apples from the orchard. Milo launched into tales, gesturing wildly. Remember when Darius tried his hand at herbs? Planted them in perfect rows. Next morning, weeds had unionized and staged a revolt. Darius's eyes crinkled. Strategic placement. For motivation. Motivation to hire you a farmer? Milo dodged a playfully tossed apple core. Rowena's already outpacing you. Rowena grinned, juice from her apple sweet on her lips. Did the character building work? Darius met her gaze, voice low amid the laughter. More than you know. Afternoon deepened the work. At a bone-dry creek bed, Rowena poured everything, the bond blazing gold. Water trickled, gathered, flowed, clear and melodic over smoothed stones, dragonflies skimming its surface. Exhaustion nipped at her edges, vision blurring faintly. Darius was there instantly, arm offered. Lean on me. I'm managing. You're swaying like a young birch in wind. His tone brooked no argument, but his touch was gentle as she accepted, his strength seeping through wool to steady her. Safety bloomed alongside a flicker of desire, simple, profound, the want for his nearness. His faith. Back at the fort by dusk, Nessa insisted on a bath. Copper tub steaming with lavender and chamomile, petals floating like stars. Rowena soaked, the bond thrumming contentment. Refreshed, she found Darius in the library, towering shelves of tomes on earth magic, shifter lore, ancient bonds. He looked up from a leather volume, pages yellowed with age. The bond feeds on emotion. Your village's cruelty starved your old land. Here, your healing mends both. She perched on the desk's edge, close enough to catch his scent. And you? What starves you? His hand rose, cupping her cheek, thumb tracing her jaw with reverence. Time suspended. She leaned into it, heart thundering. Their lips met, soft exploration blooming to deeper hunger for connection, souls recognizing mates. His arms encircled her, cedar enveloping, warmth profound and chaste. No rush, just alignment. They parted, foreheads touching. "Rowena," he breathed. "Darius." Milo's voice shattered from the hall. "Kissing by lamplight? Save tart crumbs for the peasants." Laughter cascaded. Darius groaned into her hair. "Incorrigible." "I adore him," Rowena whispered. "As do I," Darius admitted. Dinner hummed with joy. Milo's jests, Nessa's warmth. Later, by firelight, he drew her close. "Stay. As partner. Equals." "Yes." The bond sang. Land blooming beyond windows. Home found. Rowena woke to the soft patter of rain against the window panes, a gentle rhythm that matched the steady pulse of the soul root bond humming low and warm in her chest. The room felt different in the early morning light. Not unfamiliar anymore, but quietly hers. The way a garden begins to feel like home only after you have knelt in its soil and coaxed something from nothing. She lay still for a moment, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass, and let herself breathe without apology. No list of failures waiting at the edge of her thoughts. No voice telling her she was not enough. Only the sound of water, the smell of damp earth rising from below, and the faint, living pulse of a territory that had claimed her as surely as she had claimed it. She dressed slowly, running her fingers over the embroidered cuffs of her linen tunic. Nessa's doing, that small detail, and sat on the edge of the bed to lace her boots. The warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with blankets, and everything to do with a pair of dark, unblinking eyes, and the cedar scent of a man she was trying very hard not to think about too often. She was 43 years old, she reminded herself. She had survived betrayal and humiliation, and a night in a carriage that had somehow, impossibly, made her laugh. She was not a girl who confused gratitude for something deeper, but the soul root bond hummed every time she thought of him. That she could not entirely dismiss. The corridor outside her room smelled of spiced apples and toasted oats as she made her way toward the hall, her steps unhurried. A pair of young shifters carrying a basket of winter herbs nodded as she passed, one of them smiling shyly. "The northern creek is still flowing strong," the taller one said. "We saw trout this morning. Haven't seen trout there in 3 years." Rowena felt warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the soul root bond. "They'll stay as long as the water does." The girl's smile widened into something unguarded and bright. "Then we hope you stay forever." The words followed Rowena into the hall, settling somewhere tender. The long oak table groaned under the weight of the morning's offerings. A steaming pot of oat porridge thick with honey and dried fruit, platters of apple slices still glistening from the orchard, crusty loaves torn in generous pieces, and a tower of flaky pastries dusted with cinnamon sugar that could only have been assembled by one person. Milo stood at the head of the pastry display with the proprietary air of a man guarding national treasure, a mug of tea in one hand, and an expression of complete self-satisfaction on his face. "She lives," he announced, flinging his free arm wide. "The land whisperer descends to grace us with her presence. Nessa, witness this moment." Nessa, who was transferring a stack of warm bowls from a tray to the table with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no patience for theater before noon, did not look up. "I'm witnessing." "Sit down, Milo." Witnessing and unimpressed are two different things. Rowena slid onto the bench across from him, reaching for the porridge. "What exactly are you announcing?" "Your arrival, obviously." Milo settled into his seat with great ceremony. "Every morning you walk in, the hall gets approximately 15% warmer. I've been tracking the data. You've been, scientifically, with my feelings." Rowena laughed, spooning porridge into her bowl. The warmth of it spread through her palms, its sweetness rising with the steam. She had eaten alone so many mornings in her old life, at a table where the silence felt like punishment. This, the clatter of bowls, Milo's running commentary, Nessa's dry corrections, the easy noise of people who chose to share their mornings, felt like something she had been hungry for without ever knowing the name of it. Darius arrived 10 minutes later, stepping in from the courtyard corridor with rain darkening his shoulders and his dark hair damp at the edges. He shook water from his sleeves, nodded to Nessa, then crossed the room and sat beside Rowena rather than at the head of the table, close enough that she felt the cool outdoor air still clinging to him even as his warmth cut through it. "Morning," he said. "Morning." The word felt domestic and quiet and far too right in her mouth. Milo looked between them with wide, delighted eyes. "You sat beside her, voluntarily, without being asked. Nessa, are you recording this?" "I have no instruments precise enough to measure this level of nonsense," Nessa said, sitting down. Darius poured himself coffee with complete calm. "Milo." "Yes?" "The inventory room needs reorganizing." Milo clutched his pastry with both hands. "You wouldn't." "I absolutely would. This is tyranny." Milo looked to Rowena for support. "Back me up. You're the moral compass of this establishment." Rowena considered. "The inventory room does sound important." Milo stared at her in betrayed silence for exactly 3 seconds before dissolving into laughter. Darius's mouth curved, not the sharp, almost smile she had seen in the village hall, but something slower and more genuine, a warmth that started in his eyes and traveled down. Rowena felt it land somewhere she had carefully tried to keep closed. After breakfast, Darius led her to the western orchards, where the morning rain had polished the bark of every tree to a rich dark brown. The orchard stretched along a gentle slope, rows of gnarled apple trees standing with the patient dignity of things that had lived through many seasons. Some still bore a few wizened fruits from the last reluctant harvest, small and unsweet. Most were bare, their branches tangled with neglect. "These haven't fruited properly in 4 years," Darius said, running a hand along one trunk with something almost like apology in the gesture. "We tried replanting the far section last spring, but the new trees refused to take." Rowena placed her palm flat against the nearest bark. The soul root bond reached through her instantly, flowing into the root system below like water finding a channel. She felt the tree's long exhaustion, not disease, not damage, but a deep, patient waiting. They had been conserving what little life remained in the soil, protecting their cores, dreaming of a season when the conditions might change. She breathed into the bond. "The conditions have changed," she told them. "Wake now. Reach." The response was not immediate, the way a seed does not sprout in the moment it is planted. It was a slow exhale, a shifting, a loosening deep in the root mass below her feet. Then, with quiet magnificence, leaves unfurled along the nearest branches, small and perfect, tender green catching raindrops on their surfaces. Blossoms followed, white petals opening in clusters that scented the air with the apple blossom sweetness she remembered from childhood orchards. The smell of something living up to its potential. Darius stood beside her, very still. The blossoms spread along the row, tree by tree, a slow wave of white against the gray sky. Petals drifted on the rain-softened breeze, settling on their shoulders and in their hair. Rowena felt the bond sing, a bright, sustained note of satisfaction that vibrated behind her sternum. She exhaled slowly, eyes open, watching the orchard come to life. "You're changing everything," Darius said, his voice carrying a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not the commanding stillness of the rebel king, not the measured guard of a man long used to defending himself. Something quieter, more exposed. She turned her head and found him watching her rather than the blossoms. Apple petals clung to his dark hair, which should have been incongruous and was instead unbearably human. She felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the soul root bond and everything to do with the way he looked at her, as if she were not a transaction or a tool or a woman past her prime and past her use, but something rare and specific and irreplaceable. "We're changing it," she said. "The bond responds to both of us together. Haven't you noticed? It's stronger when you're near." Something moved behind his eyes. He took a half-step closer, the blossom-scented air thickening between them. His hand lifted, and she thought he might touch her face. But instead, his fingers brushed a petal from her shoulder, slow and deliberate. The touch was brief and maddening. "I've noticed," he said. Milo's voice rang from the orchard path, cheerful and entirely untimely. "Oi! Blossom Festival's lovely, but Nessa says lunch is ready, and she's threatening to redistribute the honey by committee if we're late." I can't let that happen. It would be anarchy. Darius closed his eyes briefly, the way a man accepts a weather system he cannot change. Rowena bit her lip against a smile. He does have remarkable timing. He considers it a talent. Does he practice? Apparently constantly. She walked ahead, but not before glancing back at the orchard, blossoms still opening, petals falling like soft snow against the gray morning. Something had shifted between her and Darius in those few minutes, quiet and undeniable, and the soul root bond hummed around it like a note held too long, rich with implication. Lunch was generous and loud, thick soup, warm bread, the last of the honey cakes from the day before, and a new batch Milo claimed to have supervised personally. Quality assurance, it's a calling. Nessa shared the news that 2 families from the far edge of the territory had sent word. Their well, dormant for 2 seasons, had started flowing again overnight. No explanation given, only gratitude. Rowena's heart swelled. I didn't touch that well. No, Nessa said, eyeing her steadily. But the bond did. It's spreading through the territory on its own now. Following your presence like roots follow water. Darius leaned back in his chair, watching Rowena with quiet certainty. You're not just healing patches of land. You're healing the whole territory at once. Milo raised his mug. To the woman who outpaces our king at literally everything. May she never discover how many other things need fixing. How many other things need fixing? Rowena asked, amused. Milo thought about it. An alarming number. Shall we start with Darius's interpersonal communication skills or the east barn roof? The roof, Darius said flatly. See? Communication skills. First on the list. That afternoon, Darius took her to the library. Not for lessons, but for answers. The room held centuries of the territory's history in leather-bound volumes, their spines faded and their pages soft with handling. He spread 3 books on the table, open to passages about the soul root bond, translated into plain language by someone with patient, slanted handwriting. Rowena read with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hand, while Darius stood at the window watching the rain ease. The bond passes through bloodlines, she read aloud, but activates only when the bearer has endured great hardship and then chooses freely. The land waits. It does not force. It recognizes the soul that has suffered and endured and chooses, even then, to give rather than take. The silence after that was full. She looked up at Darius, who had turned from the window and was watching her with an expression that asked nothing and said everything. Rain tapped gently at the glass. The fire crackled. The soul root bond hummed steady and warm between her ribs. It waited for you, he said, not triumphant. Not possessive, just honest. It waited for both of us to be ready, she replied. He crossed the room and sat beside her at the table, close enough for their arms to brush, and read alongside her without speaking. Rowena was aware of every point of contact, the warmth of his forearm against hers, the way he turned pages with careful hands, the sound of his breathing steady next to her ear. It was not dramatic. It was something better than dramatic. It was safe. Later, when the fire burned lower and the rain had fully stopped, leaving the world outside washed in silver, Darius turned to her with something hesitant in his face, rare enough that it caught her off guard. I owe you an explanation, he said. She waited. Why I came to the village, why I took the arrangement. He set his hands flat on the table, a grounding gesture. I had heard of the soul root bond from the territory's oldest records. A bearer passing through the region, a woman whose grief was starving the land. I thought I was acting on information. Strategy. Rowena held very still. But when I walked into that hall, he continued, his voice quieter, and I saw you standing there with your chin up and your hands folded and your entire life being discussed like a line in a ledger. Strategy stopped being the point. Her throat tightened. What was the point? He met her eyes. That no one in that room deserved you. And I could not leave you there. The words settled through her like warm rain soaking into thirsty earth. Not a declaration designed for drama. Not a performance. Just the plain, difficult truth from a man who had spent years using plainness as a shield. offering it now as a gift. Milo's voice drifted distantly down the corridor. Nessa, I think they're having a moment. Should I make tea? I feel like this calls for tea. Nessa's reply was muffled but firm. Milo again. Or biscuits. Moments need biscuits. Darius did not look away from Rowena. I apologize for him. Never, she said softly. He smiled then, a full, rare, unguarded smile that rearranged his entire face and made him look like a man who had been keeping that expression somewhere safe for a very long time and had only just decided to take it out. Rowena felt it in the center of her chest like the first day of spring. Outside the library window, the last of the rain clouds parted, and the evening sun fell across the orchard in long golden bars, setting the new apple blossoms alight. The soul root bond sang. The carriage rolled toward the village the following morning, under a sky scrubbed clean by yesterday's rain, the road ahead cutting through fields that glittered with dew. Rowena sat straight-backed, watching the familiar landscape approach through the window, each landmark pressing gently against old wounds. The bent willow at the river crossing, the crumbling stone wall where she had once sat for an hour after an argument and refused to cry, the long field where she had planted lavender, 3 springs running, only to have it dismissed as a waste of good soil. She had loved this place, truly. That was the part that made returning difficult. Not hatred, but the ache of love unreciprocated by the people who had claimed to share it. Darius sat opposite her, reading nothing, watching her with the steady attention she had come to recognize as his version of asking if she was all right without demanding she answer. She answered anyway. I'm not afraid of him. I know. I want to be clear about that before we arrive. You've been clear since the night I met you. His voice was unhurried. You have never once looked afraid, only careful. Rowena considered that. Careful isn't the same as cowardly. No, he said. Careful is what you are when you've spent years in rooms where carelessness cost you everything. The carriage jolted gently over a rut. Neither of them reached for a steadying hold this time. Rowena's hand found the bench edge, and Darius's hand found the wall, and their eyes met across the space between them with the quiet humor of 2 people who had already navigated that moment and had come out the other side with something better. Milo rode outside with the driver, his voice drifting back through the window in cheerful snatches of song. He had insisted on accompanying them. Moral support, lady, he'd said at breakfast, packing his scarf with theatrical care. And if things go sideways, I'll distract everyone with a hat trick. I have several prepared. Nessa had joined as well, carrying a small pack of supplies with the efficiency of a woman who had long ago accepted that her skills would always be needed wherever these particular 3 people gathered. The village gates appeared against the morning sky, unchanged in every visible detail. Weathered timber, lanterns unlit by day, a scatter of chickens disputing ownership of the path just inside the entrance. Rowena felt the soul root bond shift as they crossed the threshold, a tightening, like a breath held. The land here was thinner than she remembered. Not dead, but diminished, the way a garden feels when it has been tended with hands that are present, but hearts that are absent. Faces appeared at windows. Conversations paused in doorways. The ripple of recognition spread faster than the carriage moved. She came back. The whisper traveled from one end of the square to the other. Rowena stepped down from the carriage and felt the packed earth of the square beneath her boots. Pain lanced up through her ankles immediately, dull and insistent, the land's quiet distress speaking through the bond without filter. The fields beyond the village, the ones she had tended season after season, were suffering. She could feel it in her marrow. Her former companion stood waiting at the center of the square, flanked by 2 of the older elders in their dark coats. He had prepared for this, his posture too carefully arranged, his expression too controlled. He wore the face of a man who had rehearsed reasonableness. Rowena knew that face. She had been receiving it for years. Rowena. He said her name as if greeting someone who had taken an unexpected but not entirely unwelcome trip. We're glad you've come. She stopped at the appropriate distance and offered nothing beyond acknowledgement. I heard the land is struggling. Minor difficulties. His eyes moved briefly to Darius, then back, recalibrating. The spring planting was later than usual. These things correct themselves. They don't, Rowena said simply. Not on their own. One of the elders stepped forward, his face carrying the particular discomfort of a man arriving late to a conclusion everyone else had already reached. We have noticed changes since you left. The soil near the eastern plots. Fallow, she said. The herb patches near the mill are failing. The bees have moved their hives twice. The old oak near the water channel is stressed. She paused. The land speaks. I've been listening since I was 6 years old. I know every word it has for this village. Silence settled over the square. A dog padded across the stones and sat directly at Rowena's feet, leaning its weight against her ankle. A moment later, a second dog came from the far end of the square and did the same. A cat appeared from a doorway, regarded the scene with the evaluative calm of cats everywhere, and then crossed deliberately to Rowena's side. Milo, watching from near the carriage, leaned toward Nessa. The animals are voting, he whispered. She's winning by a landslide. Nessa pressed her lips together, but her eyes were warm. Her former companion's expression tightened as he watched the animals gather. The pack sees what you missed, Darius said from behind Rowena. Not loudly, not with display. Simply with the flat, settled authority of a man who had decided exactly how much patience he was prepared to offer. A group of women had edged into the square from the surrounding paths, drawn by the gathering, by the dogs, by Rowena's presence. Rowena recognized them. The miller's wife, with her careful eyes and her hands always folded as if holding herself together. The weaver from the South Lane who had never once, in 10 years of proximity, been asked what she preferred for her own life. The young woman who had been promised to an elder's son while she was still young enough to believe promises meant what they sounded like. One of them stepped forward. The miller's wife, whose name was Clara, and who had once left a bunch of rosemary on Rowena's doorstep, after a particularly bad week without explanation. The fields near our cottages, she said, voice steady despite the tremor underneath it. They've not come in right since you left. We've done everything the same as always. Not the same, Rowena said gently. The bond responds to the whole community. Its health is tied to the health of every life within it. When people are diminished, she felt the weight of the square's attention and chose her words for what they were, not for what was comfortable. When women are not given the same freedoms as men, the land reflects that. It cannot thrive where half its caretakers are not valued equally. The square went entirely silent. Her former companion opened his mouth. Rowena continued without raising her voice, because she had never needed volume for what she carried. I am not saying this to condemn you. I'm saying it because the land already knows it, and it will keep failing until the truth is faced. The older of the two elders looked at the ground. The younger stared at Clara with an expression that was rearranging itself behind his eyes. Her former companion's jaw was tight and his face had gone the color of old ash. But Darius stood quietly at Rowena's back and said nothing, because this was not his moment. It was hers, and he knew it. Rowena crossed the square to the central well. Dry for 3 months, they had told the elders in their message. She placed both hands on the stone lip and poured herself into the soul root bond. Not gently this time. Fully. The bond blazed up her arms, golden and searching, threading through the village's root system like fire through dry grass, finding every hollow, every thirst, every place where life had curled back on itself in waiting. She breathed through the resistance. The land's exhaustion was deep here, layered with years of conditional care, and kept her hands steady. I hear you, she told it. I know. Begin again. Water rose in the well. Not a trickle this time. A full, clear surge that caught the morning light and threw it back in diamonds. It spilled over the stone lip and ran in bright channels across the square, finding the cracks between cobblestones and racing toward the earth at the edges. The animals at Rowena's feet leaned closer. Somewhere beyond the square, she felt the field soil exhale. Clara had both hands pressed to her mouth. Milo sat on the edge of the carriage step, arms folded, watching with the expression of a man witnessing a coronation. There it is, he said softly, which was, for him, practically silence. Her former companion took a step forward, his voice stripped of its rehearsed control. The pack needs to hear what the land has been trying to say, Rowena said, meeting his eyes directly. Not in anger. In something steadier than anger, the kind of certainty that comes from having lived through fire and emerged not as smoke, but as stone. I will come back. Not as a possession, not as an obligation, as myself, the woman who tends this land because she chooses to. And while I am here, I will teach anyone willing to learn how the bond works. But it requires treating every life within this community as worth keeping. The elder who had been staring at Clara cleared his throat. Terms we could consider. Her former companion looked at the water still flowing across the cobblestones, at the animals gathered around Rowena, at the women who had closed ranks behind her without announcing they were doing so. He looked at Darius, who looked back at him with perfect, unhurried stillness. Then he looked at Rowena one final time. Something in his face, not remorse exactly, not yet, but the first honest flicker of understanding that what he had called a practical arrangement had been the worst decision of his life, shifted and went out. He stepped back. The square breathed. Rowena removed her hands from the well and turned to her group. Nessa handed her a water skin. Milo offered a honey cake from his pack with the gravity of a man presenting a trophy. You were extraordinary, he said simply. She accepted the cake. Don't let it go to your head. Too late. I'm already planning the commemorative scarf. Darius walked beside her as they moved back toward the carriage, close enough for his arm to brush hers, not taking her hand. This was not a moment for possession, but present. Completely, solidly present. You could have humiliated him, he said quietly. I know. You chose not to. Humiliation doesn't heal anything. I know that better than most. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're a better person than this territory deserves. No, she said, glancing at him. I'm exactly what this territory deserves. It just took a while to find out. The carriage rolled back toward the fort as the village settled behind them, the well flowing, the animals calm, the women still standing in the square with straighter spines than they'd had that morning. Rowena felt the soul root bond stretching between the two homes now, a living thread connecting her old life and her new one, pulling not from obligation but from purpose. She was still tired, still tender in the places the betrayal had dug deepest, but she was whole in a way she had not been for years. Milo broke the carriage silence after 20 minutes with, So, I've been thinking about the commemorative scarf. Gold embroidery? Or silver? Your complexion reads well in both. Darius pressed 2 fingers to his temple. Rowena leaned her head back against the seat and laughed until her sides ached, and the soul root bond sang around all of them, content as a river that has found its proper course. That evening, back at the fort, the fire burned high and dinner was warm and easy. Rowena was halfway through her second cup of tea when Nessa appeared in the doorway with an unusual stillness in her face, the kind that meant news that could not wait. A message came while you were away, she said, looking between Rowena and Darius. From the Northern Council. Darius straightened. They know about the soul root bond. Nessa set the letter on the table, her voice measured and careful. They know what she can do. And they're calling a gathering. The room went very quiet. Rowena looked at the letter, then at Darius, whose expression had closed in the way it did when something required him to be a king, rather than simply a man sitting by a fire. His eyes met hers, and beneath the alertness, beneath the calculation she could already see moving behind his gaze, was something else entirely. Fear. Not for himself. For her. What does the Northern Council want? She asked, keeping her voice even. Nessa's pause lasted just a half-second too long. They want to assess the bond, determine whether its bearer belongs to the territory or to the crown. The fire crackled. Outside, the night wind moved through the newly bloomed orchards, carrying the faint sweetness of apple blossoms across the dark. Milo, for once, said nothing. The letter sat on the table between them like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading outward in silence. Rowena did not touch it. She studied it from where she sat, noting the thick cream paper, the dark wax seal pressed with a symbol she didn't recognize, an interlocking ring of 4 crescents, each facing a different direction. Old authority. the kind that had existed long before Darius had ever called himself a rebel king. Darius picked it up after a moment, unfolding it with careful hands, his eyes moving across the lines with the particular stillness of a man reading something he had half expected and wholly dreaded. Rowena watched his jaw tighten, watched the muscle feather near his temple, watched his breathing slow to the measured pace of someone controlling a reaction rather than showing it. She had learned to read him in small ways over these weeks. The half-smile that meant he was genuinely amused, the way his shoulders lowered by a fraction when he was at ease, the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking versus the quality of it when he was deciding. This silence was the second kind, the kind that preceded consequence. Milo sat very still on the bench near the wall, honey cake untouched on the plate beside him. That, more than anything, told Rowena the gravity of the moment. Milo, still and silent, was the world slightly out of alignment. Nessa stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her expression set in the careful neutrality of someone who had already processed her own fear and moved it aside to be useful. Darius lowered the letter. The Northern Council has called a formal gathering at Thornwall. He looked at Rowena. In 12 days. What is Thornwall? She asked. The oldest seat of shifter authority in this region, Nessa said from the doorway. Older than any living pack's memory. The Northern Council convenes there when they believe a matter of territory law requires collective judgment. Rowena folded her hands in her lap. And what exactly do they believe requires judgment? Darius set the letter flat on the table, smoothing it once with his palm as if the gesture might change what was written on it. You. He met her eyes without apology. The soul root bond has not activated in this region for over 200 years. The last bearer was a woman named Sable, who bonded with the Western Territory and its alpha. The council intervened then. They claimed authority over both the bond and the bearer. What happened to her? The pause was brief, but complete. She was taken from her land by the council's order, he said. Relocated to a neutral ground the council controlled. The bond weakened without her alpha and without her land. The Western Territory declined over the following generation. The fire popped. Rain had begun again outside, soft and insistent against the shutters. Rowena felt the soul root bond pulse with a low, uneasy rhythm. Not pain, but awareness, as if the land had overheard and was drawing closer. They want to do the same to me, she said. They want to assess whether the bond belongs to my territory or to the collective authority of the Northern Council. Darius's voice was level, but she heard the controlled edge beneath it. In their interpretation, a bearer of the soul root bond represents a resource of enormous power. They would prefer that resource not reside in the territory of a rebel king with a reputation for not recognizing their authority. Milo quietly said, because of course they would. Rowena looked at the letter for a long moment. The old version of herself, the woman who had stood in a village hall and folded her hands and made herself small enough to survive, might have gone quiet now, might have waited to be told what would happen to her. But that woman had been leaving, slowly and surely, with every root she had coaxed from frozen ground, and every morning she had woken in a room that felt like hers. 12 days, she said. Yes. Then we have 12 days to prepare. Darius looked at her steadily. You understand what you're saying. If we go to Thornwall and challenge the council's authority over the bond, we will be doing so openly. There are those among the council who have wanted cause against me for years. I understand. She held his gaze. And I understand that if we don't go, they'll send someone here. And that will be worse for everyone in this territory. The people, the land, the animals, the women in my old village who are just beginning to understand they have options. She paused. I did not survive being given away to become someone else's burden to manage. The fire crackled. Outside, a horse stamped in the stable, unsettled by the weather. The soul root bond hummed steadily, and Rowena felt the territory respond. A deep, slow pulse of solidarity, traveling up through the stone floor, through the walls, through the roots of the apple trees she had woken and the creek she had restored, and the well she had filled with clear, purposeful water. Nessa unfolded her arms. I'll start preparing the travel provisions. Milo picked up his honey cake at last, took a thoughtful bite, and chewed with the expression of a man arriving at a decision. Right. Well, I'm obviously coming. Someone needs to provide comic relief during the inevitable dramatic confrontation, and frankly, I've been training for this my entire life. He pointed at Darius. Don't argue. You need me. Darius opened his mouth. You need me, Milo repeated, more firmly. A long pause. Then, eat your cake, Milo. Which was, Rowena had come to understand, his way of saying yes. She reached across the table and covered Darius's hand with hers, just briefly, the way one person anchors another when the current is picking up speed. His hand turned under hers and held, warm and certain. Neither of them spoke. The letter lay between the tea mugs and the candle stub, its dark seal catching the firelight. 12 days. The preparation began the next morning before the dew had lifted. Nessa organized provisions with military precision. Dried fruits, nuts, good bread, medicinal herbs for the road. Rowena spent the early hours in the territory, walking its borders, pressing her palms to trees and soil and stone, pouring herself into every connection available. Not from fear, but from intention. She wanted the land to know her fully before she left. Wanted to carry its memory in her blood so that no council chamber could tell her she did not belong to it. The animals followed her everywhere those 12 days. Deer at the tree line, dogs at her heels, birds overhead. The young shifters of the territory watched her rounds and began to follow, asking questions. How did she know which soil needed what? How did she feel the bond's direction? Rowena answered every question with patience and detail, because knowledge given freely is the kind that multiplies. She taught them to press their hands to the earth and listen rather than demand. She taught them that the land answers care with abundance. She taught them that the soul root bond was not magic separate from them, but a living thread woven through every life in the territory. She was simply the one born able to hear it most clearly. Darius watched her teach with an expression she had come to love. Quiet, deep, the look of a man who had spent years believing certain things were beyond reach and was still adjusting to their arrival. He worked alongside her in the evenings, poring over the old records with the focused determination of someone building a case. Not a case for possession. He was careful, always, to frame everything in terms of the bond's independence, Rowena's sovereignty, the territory's right to its own keeper. But a case for legitimacy, for the right of a woman and a land to choose each other without external authority demanding a share. Milo contributed to preparations by keeping everyone's spirits aloft with such relentless cheerfulness that it became a kind of shelter. He told stories at dinner that made the young shifters cry laughing. He organized a territory-wide baking competition on day 6. Morale is a strategic resource, Darius. Look it up. That resulted in a stunning honey rye loaf Rowena declared the finest thing she had ever eaten, which Milo received as a knighthood. Clara, the miller's wife from the village, sent a message on day 8. She had spoken to the elder who had reconsidered. 3 other women from the village had begun tending their own garden patches, hands in the soil, listening. The fields near their cottages were already responding. The message ended with, "We remember what you showed us. We are practicing." Rowena read it by the fire with Darius beside her, his arm warm and solid behind her shoulders. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, and she did not apologize for it. "They're learning," she said. "Because of you. Because they chose to." She folded the letter carefully. That's the whole point, isn't it? No one can give another person their dignity. They can only clear enough space for it to grow. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, low and without preamble, "I love you." The words came out not like a declaration designed for ceremony, but like a fact he had simply held too long and could no longer justify keeping to himself. Simple. Exact. Entirely his. Rowena felt them land like the first pulse of the soul root bond. Immediate. Undeniable. Transforming the temperature of everything around her. She turned to face him, searching his expression. No performance. No strategy. Only the truth of a man who had been built for armor and was choosing, consciously and with full awareness of the cost, to take it off. "Darius," she said, and stopped. He waited. "I have been careful with my heart for a very long time," she said slowly, "because it has been handled carelessly and it shows the marks of that. And I am 43 years old, which means I know the difference between what feels good in the moment and what is true." She paused. "This is true." She leaned in, and he met her halfway, and the kiss that followed was slow and deep and full of the kind of tenderness that only exists between people who have both survived enough loss to understand what they are choosing. The fire burned low around them. Outside, the territory breathed. Milo's voice came distantly from the corridor. "Nessa, they're definitely having a moment. I can feel it from here." "Nessa, then stop hovering outside the door." "Milo, I'm not hovering. I'm providing a warm atmospheric presence." Rowena laughed against Darius's mouth. He rested his forehead against hers, his hands steady on either side of her face, and laughed too, quietly, privately, just for her. 3 days later, they left for Thornwall at dawn. The territory watched them go, deer at the gate, birds in formation overhead. The young shifters lining the path with their hands pressed briefly to the ground in the gesture Rowena had taught them. A farewell and a promise at once. Clara's words folded in Rowena's pocket. The soul root bond stretched behind her like a long golden thread, taut with connection, thrumming with the health of everything she had woken and tended and chosen to love. She did not look back until the gate had closed. Then she looked back once, fully, taking in every tree and rooftop and lantern. Darius, beside her on the carriage seat, said nothing. He did not need to. His hand found hers, and they rode toward Thornwall together, the road long and the morning clear and everything ahead still uncertain. But nothing, not one breath of it, faced alone. Thornwall rose from the hillside like something the earth had decided to keep rather than allow men to fully claim. The ancient seat of the Northern Council occupied a promontory of dark stone, its walls grown over with centuries of ivy and moss that softened their severity without diminishing it. Great trees, oaks older than the council itself, their trunks wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, lined the final approach road, their roots lifting the stone path in gentle, insistent arches. The air here was different, heavier, older, layered with the accumulated authority of every gathering that had taken place within those walls, since the first shifter packs had agreed, grudgingly, to share territory rather than fight over it endlessly. Rowena felt it before she saw it. The soul root bond reacted to Thornwall the way a deep-rooted tree reacts to a change in barometric pressure. Not panic, but heightened awareness. Every sense sharpened. The colors in the landscape seemed richer, the smells more distinct. Pine resin and cold stone, a thread of wood smoke from fires burning within, the mineral sharpness of ancient groundwater close to the surface. Her palms tingled. The bond was reading this place, cataloging it, and what it returned to her was complex. Old power, yes, but also old wounds, old arguments, old decisions made by people who had mistaken authority for wisdom. The council representatives met them at the outer gate, 3 figures in coats of deep gray, their collars bearing the 4-crescent symbol from the letter's seal. One was a tall woman with white-streaked hair and the kind of face that had settled long ago into permanent careful assessment. Her name, Nessa had told them on the road, was Aldara, the council's senior voice, in the territory's matters for longer than most people's memories reached. Aldara looked at Rowena with the particular attention of someone who had been told to expect a threat, and was now recalibrating toward something more complicated. "Bearer," she said. Rowena held the woman's gaze without flinching. "My name is Rowena." A small pause. Then Aldara inclined her head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. "Rowena, welcome to Thornwall." The inner hall was vast and cold, its ceiling lost in shadow above timber beams black with age. Long stone benches curved in a half-circle facing a central dais, and on those benches sat the assembled council members, 9 in total, ranging from a young male with the alert eyes of someone newly appointed to an elder so ancient he seemed to have been present when the walls were built. Torches burned at intervals along the walls, casting everything in amber and shadow. There was no softness in this room. It had been designed for decisions, not comfort. Rowena walked in beside Darius and felt the room assess them both with the same thoroughness she might press her hands to unfamiliar soil. She let it. She had nothing to hide and no energy left for performing smallness. Milo entered behind them and looked around the chamber with the expression of a man at a particularly serious theatrical production. He said nothing, which required, Rowena suspected, enormous effort. Nessa took a position near the side wall with quiet precision, her pack at her feet and her eyes moving constantly across the room's geography, the way a practical woman maps an unfamiliar space before committing to a position in it. Aldara took her place at the center of the dais. The other council members settled. The torchlight shifted. "We have called this gathering," Aldara began, her voice carrying easily in the stone space, "to address the activation of the soul root bond in the Eastern Territory, the first confirmed activation in 211 years. The Council has authority, under the Charter of Living Lands, to assess any active bond and determine the disposition of its bearer for the protection of the collective territory." Darius stepped forward. "The Charter of Living Lands was written to protect bearers from exploitation, not to enable it." Several council members stirred. The young one at the end leaned forward. "The Charter's intent," one of the middle council members began, "is exactly what Darius said," Rowena said clearly, and the room went quiet. Not because she raised her voice, because she did not, and the steadiness of it drew more attention than volume would have. She walked to the center of the floor, between the benches, and stood on the cold stone without a single concession to the authority arranged around her. "I have read what records exist of the soul root bond. The charter was written after the removal of Sable, the bearer 200 years ago, specifically because the Council's decision to relocate her destroyed both her bond and the Western Territory's health for a generation. The charter was meant to prevent a repetition of that harm. I would like someone in this room to explain to me how removing me from my territory now would produce a different result." Silence. The elder at the far end of the bench opened his eyes, which Rowena had not been certain he was doing with regularity. His gaze was ancient and very clear. "She has read the original charter," he said, as if confirming something to himself. "Cover to cover," Rowena replied. "Twice. Once for information, and once to look for the places where it had been selectively interpreted." Aldara studied her. "You're not what I expected." "No," Rowena said. "I don't imagine I am." What followed was not a battle. It was something harder, in its own way, an argument conducted entirely in words, in evidence, in the quiet, rigorous presentation of truth against assumption. Darius spoke with the precision of a man who had spent 12 days building a case from every record in his library. He named precedents. He cited the charter's original intent with the specificity of someone who had memorized it rather than merely read it. He was, Rowena realized, not the rebel king in this room. He was something more considered than that, a man who had chosen, long ago, to refuse authority that had proven unworthy of him, and who was now demonstrating that refusal had nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with principle. She watched him and felt pride so deep it surprised her. When the council pushed back, and they did, particularly the middle contingent who had the most invested in the old interpretation, Rowena spoke again. She described what she had done in the territory, not as argument, but as record. The northern fields, the dried creek, the eastern garden, the well in her old village, the women who had begun learning to tend their own soil and found it responding to their hands. She described the soul root bond not as a power to be controlled, but as a relationship between a person and a land, and the life that grew in both. She used no dramatic language. She used only what she had lived. The young council member at the end of the bench had stopped leaning forward. He was now very still, with the expression of someone whose previous certainty had developed a significant crack. Milo, sitting quietly on a bench near the back, folded his hands in his lap and looked at the floor, and his silence was the loudest endorsement in the room. Aldara called a recess at midday. The council members filed into a side chamber, their voices low and serious behind the closed door. Rowena, Darius, Nessa, and Milo gathered near a window where cold light filtered through thick glass. Outside, the ancient oaks lined the approach road. Their bare winter branches crossed against the pale sky. Rowena placed her hand briefly against the window's stone sill. The soul root bond reached, tentative but willing, into the old ground below Thornwall's foundations. What it found there was unexpected, not stone dead, but dormant, waiting. Something in this ancient place had been sleeping for a very long time, patient as a seed through winter. "The land here remembers her," Rowena said softly. "Sable?" Nessa asked. "Yes. She was here before they moved her. The grief is still in the ground." Rowena paused, feeling it, the long, patient sorrow of a bond interrupted, of a land that had kept the memory of its keeper 200 years beyond her departure. It never fully released. Darius stood very close behind her, not crowding, but present. "Can you ease it?" She considered. "Maybe, if the council allows it." She turned from the window to look at him, and if they do, if they see what the bond does when it's honored rather than controlled, that might be more persuasive than anything we've argued. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment, not calculating, considering, the way he did when he trusted her judgment and was simply taking time to fully recognize it. "Then we ask," he said. When Aldara returned, Rowena made a single request before the session resumed: permission to approach the foundation stone of Thornwall's central courtyard and attempt to ease what she had felt there. She explained plainly what she had found: the dormant bond sorrow, the ancient grief in the land, the memory of Sable that had been held in the stone for 2 centuries. The elder at the end of the bench spoke before Aldara could respond. "Grant it." Aldara looked at him. He looked back. "The land has waited long enough. Let the bearer tend it. We watch." The courtyard was open to the sky, a square of cobblestones and old flagging at Thornwall's heart, bordered by the great oaks. The entire council filed out to watch from the covered walkway. Milo stood to one side with his hands clasped, his usual humor entirely set aside. Nessa stood at Rowena's left shoulder, Darius at her right. Rowena knelt on the cold stone, both palms flat, and opened herself to the soul root bond completely. It rushed through her like a river breaking a dam, not violent but enormous, the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of patient sorrow rising all at once. She felt Sable's grief like a pressed flower preserved in stone, old, fragile, heartbreakingly intact. She felt the land's long loneliness, and she poured into it everything she had learned to pour: steadiness, acknowledgement, the particular compassion that only comes from shared experience. "I know," she told it. "I know what it is to be taken from where you belong. I know the shape of that loss. You can release it now. The world has not forgotten you." The courtyard exhaled. Green crept across the cobblestones, moss returning to every crack and seam with the quiet speed of something too long compressed. The oaks shuddered, the deep root tremor moving up their trunks and into their branches, which filled, unexpectedly and entirely out of season, with the first tender green of new leaves. Spring breaking in winter, because the land had something to celebrate. Birds came from nowhere, landing in the oaks, the courtyard, the covered walkway. One landed on the old elder's outstretched hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Rowena. "The charter," he said quietly to Aldara, "was written to prevent exactly this kind of loss from occurring again." He gestured at the courtyard, the moss, the birds, the green pushing through old stone. "This is what honoring the bond looks like. I believe we have our answer." The vote, when it came that evening, was 7-2 in favor of recognizing the soul root bond as sovereign to the bearer and the territory, not subject to council relocation or control. The 2 dissenters were noted and silent. Aldara signed the new accord herself, her white-streaked hair catching the torchlight. She handed the sealed document to Rowena, not to Darius. "It belongs to you," she said. Rowena accepted it with steady hands. "Thank you for hearing us." "Thank you," Aldara said. And Rowena heard in her voice something that had not been there that morning, Something very old and very tired, finally, gently setting itself down. For reminding us what the charter was for. They stayed the night in Thornwall's guest chambers, and in the morning the ancient oaks outside were still in new leaf, improbable and green against the winter sky. Milo declared it a triumph over breakfast, ate 4 rolls in rapid succession, and then sat back with the satisfied expression of a man whose faith in the natural order of things had been thoroughly vindicated. Nessa refilled everyone's tea without being asked, and the table was warm and alive with quiet happiness. Darius, across from Rowena, reached over and covered her hand. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over and held his, and the soul root bond hummed between them, steady, deep, and entirely their own. But when they stepped outside to the carriages, a young woman was waiting by the gate, barely 20, with frightened eyes and the careful stillness of someone who had spent years in rooms where the wrong movement had consequences. She held her hands clasped at her waist, and she looked at Rowena the way a person looks at a lamp in the dark, not certain it will last, but desperate for its direction anyway. "Are you the bearer?" she asked. Rowena looked at her for a moment, at the carefully folded hands, at the stillness that recognized itself. "Yes," she said, and stepped toward her. The woman's breath broke apart like ice in spring. "As your future was decided without your consent," she whispered. 3 villages east. The elders arranged it. As your future was decided without your consent. The courtyard behind Rowena was very quiet. Rowena took the woman's hands in hers, cold, trembling, real, and felt the soul root bond pulse with something that had nothing to do with Earth and everything to do with it. Purpose, direction, the particular gravity of a life finding its lane and feeling the road rise to meet it. "Tell me her name," Rowena said. And the next chapter of everything began. The morning of the gathering arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes something irreversible. Rowena felt it in the air before she opened her eyes. A held breath quality in the atmosphere, as if the territory itself knew that today would decide the shape of everything that followed. The soul root bond hummed in her chest with unusual intensity, not anxious, not warning, but alert in the way of a living thing fully awake and paying close attention. She lay in the warmth of the bed she had come to know as hers, and let herself feel every thread of it. The pulse of the orchard beyond the window, the deep, steady heartbeat of the northern fields, the bright current of the restored creek threading through the land like a vein of silver, the borrowed warmth of the man sleeping beside her whose breathing had become, over these months, as familiar and grounding as the sound of rain. She rose without waking him, dressed in the gray-green wool tunic Nessa had laid out the night before, laced her boots with steady hands, and went to the window. The courtyard below was already alive with careful preparation. Nessa moved between the long tables being arranged along the eastern garden path, directing 2 young shifters with the crisp efficiency of a woman who had decided that today would be organized if it was the last thing she accomplished on this earth. Milo was attempting to hang lanterns from the old oak near the gate and had somehow already become entangled in the rope, narrating his predicament to no one in particular with the philosophical acceptance of a man accustomed to these situations. Beyond the fort walls, Rowena could feel them arriving, not with her eyes, with the bond. The soul root. Bond registered the approach of living things the way still water registers the touch of a stone. A ripple, then another, then a spreading pattern of presence. Women from the village, the ones Clara had been teaching. The young shifters from the far reaches of the territory who had learned to press their hands to the ground and listen. Families from the outlying settlements whose wells now ran clean and whose fields now answered their labor with genuine abundance. The young woman from Thornwall's Gate, whose name was Petra, whose sister had been found and returned to her family 3 months ago, through a quiet, determined effort that had required Rowena and Darius to travel to 3 different villages and refuse to leave without resolution. They were all coming today, not for a ceremony of power, not for a display of authority, for something Rowena had proposed 6 weeks ago in the library, while Darius read beside her and Milo ate biscuits at the far end of the table, and the fire burned low and comfortable. A gathering of every woman in the territory and its surrounding villages who had been treated as something less than what she was. Not to mourn that. To begin, formally, collectively, with witnesses and intention, to change it. Darius appeared in the doorway behind her. She heard him before she turned, the particular weight of his step, the cedar and leather warmth of him preceding his presence in the room. His hands found her shoulders, his chin resting at her temple as he looked out the window beside her. "They're already at the gate," he said. "I know." She leaned back into him. "I felt them arriving." His arms wrapped around her, unhurried and complete. 2 years ago, in a carriage on a dark road, she had told herself not to confuse gratitude for something deeper. She smiled quietly at the memory of that caution. Necessary then, unnecessary now. What she felt for Darius had nothing to do with gratitude. It had to do with being known, with the specific irreplaceable experience of being seen by someone who had no obligation to look and had chosen to look anyway, and kept choosing every morning since. "Nervous?" he asked. "No," she said. "Ready." She felt him smile against her hair. Below, Milo had successfully freed himself from the lantern rope and was now holding it triumphantly above his head like a trophy, his scarf listing to one side. Nessa appeared at his elbow, took the rope from him with one firm motion, and hung the lantern herself in approximately 4 seconds. Milo watched this with the expression of a man who had been both rescued and humbled, and was choosing to frame it as a collaboration. Rowena dressed her hair with the carved wooden pin Darius had given her on the morning after Thornwall. A simple thing, dark wood with a small leaf pattern at the tip, unremarkable to anyone else and precisely right to her. She took a breath, let it go. Then she walked downstairs and into the morning with her chin level and her hands open and the soul root bond singing its steady note through every bone of her. The gathering filled the eastern garden and spilled into the courtyard beyond. There were more women than Rowena had expected. She had hoped for 40, perhaps 50 from the closest settlements. Instead, the garden path was lined 3 and 4 deep with faces she recognized and faces she was seeing for the first time. Women of every age. Some by the allies they had found in husbands and brothers who had, slowly, begun to understand that a territory where women flourished was a territory where everyone flourished. A few of the council's own representatives had sent observers, and one had come herself. The young council member who had sat at the end of the bench at Thornwall with a cracking certainty, whose name was Evan, and who had, in the months since, become one of the charter's most vocal advocates. Clara stood near the front, her posture so different from the careful self-containment Rowena remembered that she might have been a different woman. She was not. She was the same woman, simply occupying more of the space she had always deserved. Beside her stood Petra, holding her sister's hand with the quiet fierceness of someone who had learned exactly how much could be lost and how much could be reclaimed. Rowena stood before all of them and felt the soul root bond open like a flower that has finally grown large enough for its full shape to be visible. She did not give a speech designed to stir. She spoke the way she always spoke, plainly, warmly, with the particular authority of someone who had not been handed her standing, but had grown it from the ground. She told them what the soul root bond had taught her, that land thrives when those who tend it are free. That abundance is not a product of control, but of care. That every time a woman in this territory had been diminished, silenced, or had her choices taken away, the earth had registered it, not as abstract principle but as actual measurable loss. And every time a woman had been restored to herself, the land had answered with life. She told them about the charter, about what it now protected, about the fact that no gathering of elders or council could legally arrange the trade or sale of a woman in any territory that had signed the Thornwall Accord, which, as of 6 weeks ago, included every pack within 3 days' ride. She told them about the teaching circles she and Clara had been building, small groups meeting weekly, women learning to read their own soil, tend their own plots, build their own knowledge of the bond's language. Not because every woman was a bearer, only one was, but because the bond responded to every life within the territory, and every woman who knew her own worth made the whole land richer. Then she stopped speaking, and the garden was quiet for exactly one breath. Then Clara began to applaud. Then Petra. Then every woman in the courtyard, the sound of it rising through the morning air like birds taking flight, filling the old fort walls with something they had perhaps never contained before, the specific, irreplaceable sound of people recognizing that something real had changed. Rowena did not cry. She stood straight and received it, the way she had learned to receive good things, not with dismissal, not with apology, but with simple, open acknowledgement. I accept this. I am worthy of this. I helped make this. In the crowd, she found Darius's eyes. He stood at the back, near the gate, his arms folded, his expression carrying everything she had come to love most in it. The quiet pride of a man who had not built this and knew it, and who was glad, genuinely and completely glad, that it existed. He was not diminished by her strength. He was enlarged by it. That, she had come to understand, was the whole difference. Not between good men and bad ones, but between men who understood that love is not a transaction, and men who had never learned that it doesn't have to be. He caught her looking, and the corner of his mouth moved. She looked away before she smiled, because Nessa was watching from the side with the expression of someone taking notes for future reference. And Milo had already clasped his hands under his chin, and was making a face of theatrical sentimentality that would require a firm response if encouraged. The rest of the day unfolded in the unhurried warmth of community. Long tables covered in food from the territory's now abundant stores. The young shifters serving with pride, children chasing each other between the apple trees. Rowena moved through the gathering and stopped at every face that needed stopping at. The woman whose husband had begun attending the new community council meetings because she had asked him to. The elder from the village who had quietly, without announcement, removed the old ledger from the hall and started a new one. Evan from the Northern Council, who sat beside Clara for most of the afternoon in conversations so serious and productive that Nessa eventually brought them a second pot of tea, without being asked. Milo organized a singing competition at midday that descended within minutes into cheerful chaos, then ascended unexpectedly into something genuinely beautiful when Petra and her sister sang together. A simple old folk melody that stilled the whole courtyard and made even Darius set down his cup and listen. Late in the afternoon, when the light had gone gold and long across the garden and the gathering had softened into the easy warmth of people who had eaten well and said true things, Rowena found herself standing alone for a moment at the base of the great oak near the gate. She pressed her palm to its bark, a habit now as natural as breathing. The soul-root bond flowed easily, content, expansive, the whole territory breathing in its sleep like a living thing at peace. Her former companion had left the village 4 months ago. She had heard it quietly through Clara's letters. He had gone to a settlement farther east, diminished not by any punishment imposed on him, but by the simple, inexorable consequence of a community that had begun to see itself differently. The elders who remained had asked Rowena to help them revise the village accords. She had agreed. Not in forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a private matter, worked out in her own time, in her own terms, but in the understanding that people change when given real reason to, and that the best thing she could do with what had happened to her was make sure it happened to fewer people after her. She felt Darius arrive beside her before she saw him. His warmth, his scent, the quiet shift of the air that had become the specific signature of his presence to her body and her bond alike. He said nothing for a moment, standing with her at the oak, his shoulder pressed to hers. The garden stretched before them, full of the soft noise of the gathering winding toward its close. Last cups of tea, voices carrying in the evening air. "We need to talk about the Eastern Settlement's water channel," he said. She glanced at him. "Now? I've been waiting all day for a practical moment. Darius. The channel runs under a root system that— Darius." He stopped, looked at her. The gold light caught the lines of his face, the worn places, the patient ones, the particular depth behind his eyes that she had first glimpsed in a lantern-lit village hall and had been discovering ever since. His hand found hers, fingers threading through. "Later," he said. "Thank you." Milo appeared at her other elbow with 2 cups of something warm and the expression of a man who had decided his timing was, on this occasion, perfectly calibrated. Evening tea. Nessa's blend. She added something floral. He held out both cups, looked between them, and sighed with the profound satisfaction of a man whose life had exceeded his expectations. "Look at this. Look at where we are. 2 years ago, one of you had your future decided by others and the other was being called dishonorable. And now," he gestured broadly at the garden, the gathering, the blooming orchard, the fort alive with warmth and purpose. "This." Rowena accepted her cup. "Are you about to become emotional, Milo?" "Absolutely not," he sniffed. "My eyes are simply responding to the floral blend." Darius, very quietly, put his arm around the smaller man's shoulders for exactly 3 seconds, brief, complete, entirely genuine, and then released him. Milo stared straight ahead with the look of a man who had received a knighthood and was trying not to show how much it meant. Nessa appeared at the edge of the path. "Petra's sister is asking about the teaching circle schedule for next month, and the settlement families want to know if the keeper will walk the southern border before the spring planting." "Tell them yes," Rowena said. "Both." Nessa nodded and turned back, then paused. Without facing them, she said, quietly, to no one in particular, in the tone of someone making a notation they had been meaning to make for some time, "You did well. Both of you. All of us." Then she walked away, which was Nessa's version of a standing ovation. The last light faded from the garden. Rowena stood between the oak and the man she loved, holding warm tea and listening to the soul root bond settle into its evening rhythm. Slow, deep, content as a field after a full season's harvest. She thought of the night 2 years ago when she had stood in a village hall and felt the weight of every judgment in the room, the cold lantern light, the smell of burning herbs, the silence that preceded a woman's life being decided without her. She thought of stepping forward rather than back, of the earth answering, of a carriage on a dark road and a voice that said, "You have not laughed in a long time," with such honest precision that it had cracked something open in her that had been sealed for years. She thought of Clara's rosemary left on a doorstep, of Petra's sister singing in the courtyard, of the young shifter girl who had said, "We hope you stay forever," with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had not yet learned to be careful about hope. The soul root bond pulsed once, long, warm, resonant, and the apple trees in the orchard released a last drift of evening petals, white against the darkening sky, settling on the tables and the paths and the shoulders of people who had gathered here because something true had been built in this place, and they had wanted to stand inside it for a day. Rowena closed her eyes, felt the land beneath her feet, her land, her territory, her belonging, felt the man beside her, steady as an oak, chosen freely and choosing freely in return, felt the full, improbable, hard-won weight of a life that had been nearly traded away and had instead become something extraordinary. She opened her eyes. The first stars were appearing above the orchard. "Ready to go in?" Darius asked. She looked up at the stars for one more moment, at the petals still drifting, at the lanterns Milo had finally managed to hang straight, their light warm and unwavering along the garden path. "Almost," she said. She pressed her free hand once more to the oak's bark, and the soul root bond answered. A full, resonant chord rising through her palm, her arm, her chest, threading out through the territory in every direction at once, north to the flowing creek, east to the revived fields, west to the blooming orchard, south to where Petra and Clara were still talking by the last lit table, voices low with the seriousness of women building something that will last. "Thank you," she told the land. The oak's leaves stirred, though the evening air was still. Then Rowena turned from the tree, tucked her hand into Darius's arm, and walked with him through the lantern-lit garden and into the warm, bright, noise-filled fort, home, entirely and at last, not because she had been placed there, but because she had chosen it, and it had chosen her, and nothing that had tried to diminish her had ever understood that the two were the same thing. Behind them, Milo's voice rose cheerfully above the evening noise. Nessa, she touched the tree again. Should I log it? I feel like we should be logging these. Nessa's reply was immediate and dry. Go to bed, Milo. That's a no on the log then. That is a very firm no. The fort doors closed behind Rowena and Darius, and the garden settled into its quiet night breathing. Petals on the flagstones, lanterns burning, the soul root bond warm and whole beneath it all, alive in every root, every stone, every life that had chosen to take root here and grow. If this story moved you, if it was the moment in the village hall, or the night the orchard bloomed, or the gathering at Thornwall, or the last petals falling at sunset, leave a comment and tell me which part stayed with you longest. And if you want more stories about women who were written off and became extraordinary, about dangerous men who learned what it means to truly choose someone, and about lands and bonds and love that answers even when the world doesn't, you know where to find them. Thank you for listening.